Hey everyone, my name is Dan and I make competitive Warhammer 40k content. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of playing by intent. It's a common term that many other people have made videos on or even written articles about, but I'm going to give kind of my spiel about playing by intent and what it means to me. So in my mind, the term playing by intent is actually kind of a misnomer, because of course every time you do something in a game of Warhammer 40k, you're intending to do something. You know, you move forward so you can shoot. You charge so you can get into combat. That's always your intent. Every time you play a game of Warhammer 40k, you're playing with intent. But the idea of playing by intent is that you are having an agreed upon board state with your opponent. In my mind, playing by intent is narrating both the purpose and distances of your actions preemptively. The point of playing by intent is to prevent conflict about measuring distances or what you were trying to do. Playing by intent should reduce feel-bads in your game of Warhammer 40k. It's very important to know that playing by intent is not supposed to be an analog for sloppy play or a way to break rules or ignore reality. It's rather kind of just a shorthand way to simplify a very complex game of measurements and movements. Additionally, playing by intent is supposed to reduce the amount of feel-bads you have with your opponent by having everyone understand what is going on in the game of Warhammer 40k. So something that's very important to know is that Warhammer 40k is what's considered a measure always game. And that means at any time in the game, you can measure any distance between anything. Now this was not always the case for Warhammer, and it is actually not very common in older war games. So in fact, it used to be in Warhammer that you were not allowed to measure things at all times. In fact, you could only measure when you were actually doing an action like shooting. The reason why this is because they wanted estimation of measurements to be part of a core game mechanic in Warhammer 40k, and they even had weapons that you had to estimate the distance of when you were shooting them. If we go back even further all the way to games like Warhammer Fantasy Battles, even your charge ranges weren't actually random. It would be something like twice your movement, or maybe your movement +3 in some other games. So the question was never, am I going to make this 9-inch charge? But I have a 9-inch charge. Is this actually exactly 9 inches, or is it less or more? Many old war games, like previous iterations, 7th edition Warhammer 40k, Warhammer Fantasy, War Machine Mark I, were always games where you could not measure always. They were a measure sometimes game. Almost all modern war games have gone to a measure always system because it allows you to prevent these really frustrating moments in games where one guy thinks something's 8 inches and another person thinks it's 8.1 inches. If you're like me and you've gone to those tournaments where we had blast templates and estimated distances and unknown charge rolls, you would have to get judges constantly. Every time you had a charge that was even slightly off, there was always a judge that needed to be called because nobody could actually decide what the measurements were. So playing by intent is our way around that, and we can do this because Warhammer 40k is a measure always game. One really good example of playing by intent is threat ranges. For example, if I ask you, hey, what are the threat range of those Space Marines? And you said, well, they move 6 inches, they've got a 24-inch gun, so it's 30 inches. And I said, okay, I intend to stay out of the range of those Space Marines when I move up these models, so I'm going to put them just outside of 30 inches. And I measure, and we both agree, yep, you're outside of 30 inches. Then if you take your turn, move 6 inches, and try to shoot, you already know you're outside of range. And if you measure it and you say, hey, actually you're 23.9 inches away, I've got a 24-inch gun, therefore I can shoot you. Well, that's a little frustrating because I thought we agreed that I was outside range. Did you maybe accidentally move, a 0.1 inch more than you should have? I went through the effort of saying, hey, I'm going to be 30 inches away. I showed you the measurement, we agreed, and then you said you're somehow in range. That can be really frustrating, and that's why we're agreeing on the intent of my move and agreeing on the measurements beforehand. It's very possible that I could do that measurement, think I'm outside of 30, and then you would correct me and say, hey, no, that's actually not 30. I think you're measuring a little too short. Back up, a quarter of an inch. That's what we're trying to get to by playing by intent. All we're trying to do is have both players agree upon the measurement while we're measuring preemptively. Additionally, if I ask you, hey, what's the threat range of your Space Marines? And you say, well, they've got a 6-inch move and a 24-inch gun, so 30. But then you don't tell me you have a stratagem that increases their shooting range by 6 inches, that seems kind of deceptive. You clearly understood that I was asking, how far can these, Space Marines attack? And you purposely left out a known stratagem. Now, of course, if you've warned me about the stratagem several times before, I can kind of understand it. But the purpose and intent behind my question is clear. What is the threat range of that unit? Now, sure, by rules as written, they don't have that stratagem as part of their data sheet, so you're not really lying to me, but that's a really kind of sleazy thing to do to someone. And honestly, if that's how you have to win a game of Warhammer 40k, then I'm not too sure what to say to you, man. I'm not too sure what to say. I can think of another couple examples of why intent is so important beyond just some, kind of agreed upon measurement. So one pretty basic example is scenic bases. A lot of scenic bases will actually kind of overhang the base just a little bit. So for example, in my Thousand Suns army, I have bases that are made out of corkboard and acrylic paste. And I kind of like how they look irregularly, and sometimes a little bit of the corkboard overhangs the base. Now let's say my opponent also had a little bit of corkboard that overhung their base, and I tried to put these two models in base to base. It would be physically impossible. But if I said, hey, I'm charging you, I've rolled enough inches to get in base to base, my model does not physically fit in base to base with you, but we know because of the wobbly model syndrome, we're both allowed to agree on the place that the model actually is. Now, being base to base is incredibly important because if you're base to base during the combat phase, you're not allowed to pile in or consolidate. It would be really, really crappy of the person I'm playing against to be like, well, sure you said you're in base to base, but our models don't fit, so I'm actually gonna move, all the way around you in the combat phase, even though we agreed on it beforehand. And even besides bases, there are some models that just really do not fit together very well. Take, Tyranid Termagants. They overhang their base by half of their body. But we know that these models should be able to go together. We probably could spend a few minutes turning them around, maybe all our guys face backwards, just so we can push our bases together. But is that how we want to play a game of Warhammer 40k? Agonizing over fractions of a millimeter of an inch and turning our models just so we can play? It really isn't. If the models can fit somewhere and you both agree on it, then just leave it at that. Now, if your model doesn't charge far enough to be able to get into base to base, then it doesn't matter what you intend, you can't do it. So here's another important example. Let's say I've got a character with a 40mm base, and he also has a 3-inch heroic intervention because he's a character. If I put him exactly in the middle of an objective marker, there is nowhere on the objective that he can't heroically intervene to. Let's say in my turn, I put my guy kind of sort of in the middle of the objective and then I don't say anything. And my opponent takes their turn and they move stuff on the objective, go to combat phase, don't charge, and then I say, hey, I'm gonna heroically intervene because you're within 3 inches. And actually the distance is 3.1. Well, the person who made the move initially with the character is not in the right to actually make that heroic intervention because they did not announce their intent beforehand. And if someone doesn't tell you what they're trying to do, it's really not fair for them to tell you, oh, well, I was actually trying to do X, Y, or Z way after the fact. You're totally within your right as an opponent if somebody doesn't say something and clearly leaves an opening to take advantage of that. It's not fair for your opponent to say retroactively, well, I intended to do whatever. If they didn't say it preemptively, then that's on them. So one really frustrating example I've heard from a tournament is where a guy had a great unclean one that was coming out of Deep Strike. And essentially what he was trying to do was create an opening for the base of the Great Unclean One. So he said to his opponent, hey, I'm going to put this Great Unclean One down, even though it's not the end of the movement phase, and then move my guys around so that way I can maximize, the auras. Now this person is well within their right to measure any distance at any time, and they could spend several minutes to make sure there was an exactly Great Unclean One size base. But per the rules, if you are putting down your Great Unclean One, you only do that at the end of your movement phase, and then you would, automatically end your movement phase. But is that how we want to play a game of Warhammer 40k? Not at all. Let the person put their Great Unclean One down and use it to measure around. That's totally ridiculous that anyone would ever say, oh, no, you put your model down even though you're trying to just, make sure all the measurements were correct, like your turn's done. That's terrible, and honestly, I just wouldn't play someone who wanted to play a game like that. That's not very much fun for me. It's important to know that playing by intent is not necessarily an enforceable rule. If you want to play a game where you tell your opponent, hey, I don't like to play by intent, you measure all your distances, don't tell me why you're doing it, and if I see something I can take advantage of, I'm going to take advantage of it. If that's how you want to play, and if that's how you and your friends have fun, then go at it. No one's saying you can't do that. I just want you to be aware of how many kind of higher level players will play their games. Most people try to avoid gotchas and play an upfront game of Warhammer 40k. That's how I would like to play it as well. As long as you make sure that you and your opponent are on the same page before you start the game of what type of game you're playing, I think that is the best way to do it. So if you have any other examples of playing by intent or examples of maybe when something went wrong, leave it in the comments below. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.